The Atlanta sun in May is a special kind of blessing, a heavy golden blanket that drapes itself over the manicured lawns of Buckhead, making the very air shimmer with wealth. At the Sterling Estate, a historic property wrested from the hands of old white money 2 generations ago, that shimmer felt like a divine anointing. This was more than a wedding, it was a coronation. Elijah Sterling, the heir to the Sterling Enterprises real estate empire, was marrying Gabrielle "Gabby" Laurent, a woman who seemed to have been spun from light and purpose. Cascades of white gardenias and cream roses tumbled from marble urns, their sweet, heady perfume mixing with the old money scent of magnolia and whispered power. A string quartet played softly near a sprawling oak tree, its ancient branches offering dappled shade to guests dressed in pastel silks and bespoke suits. This was the pinnacle of Black Atlanta society, a carefully curated world of doctors, lawyers, politicians, and entrepreneurs. A world Harrison Sterling Sr. had built not just with brilliance and ruthlessness, but as a fortress against a society that had once told him he was worth nothing. Elijah stood at the altar, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was a handsome man, inheriting his father's sharp jaw and imposing height, but his eyes held a warmth that Harrison's had long since lost. When he saw Gabby begin her walk down the aisle, the world dissolved into a single, perfect focus. She was breathtaking in an ivory gown that clung to her slender frame, her smile a beacon of pure joy that seemed to reach him long before she did. She was everything his world was not, gentle where it was hard, open where it was guarded, a community organizer who fought for the forgotten, while his family built monuments for the rich. At the head of the front pew sat Harrison Sterling Sr., a king observing his court. At 65, he was a monument carved from granite and ambition. His custom-tailored suit couldn't conceal the raw power in his shoulders, a remnant from his younger days when he'd fought for every inch of ground he now owned. His face, a mask of stoic control, betrayed nothing. Beside him, his wife Victoria was the picture of elegance and quiet tension, a beautiful orchid flourishing in a steel greenhouse. She smiled, but the expression never quite reached her tired eyes. The vows were a blur of heartfelt promises and tearful smiles. When the minister declared them husband and wife, Elijah's kiss was full of a desperate, profound love. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of celebration washing over them. As they turned to face their future, beaming, Elijah caught his father's eye. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw a flicker of something. Pride, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it came. The reception began in the grand ballroom, a sea of crystal chandeliers and joyful noise. Elijah and Gabby took to the floor for their first dance, a slow, swaying embrace under a spotlight's soft glow. They were lost in their own universe, oblivious to the dozens of phones capturing the moment. "I love you, Mrs. Sterling," Elijah whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I love you," Gabby replied, her eyes shining. "Forever?" At the head table, Harrison Sterling Sr. sat unmoving. He watched the dancing couple not with the fondness of a father, but with the unnerving focus of a hawk studying its prey. He mechanically raised a glass of champagne to his lips when prompted by his wife, but his eyes never left the floor. Then, it happened. A subtle vibration against his chest. He slipped his phone from his inner jacket pocket, his movements economical and precise. He glanced at the screen. The change was almost imperceptible, but for anyone watching closely, it was terrifying. The granite mask didn't crack, but it hardened, seeming to draw all the light and warmth from the air around him. The muscles in his jaw clenched. 3 seconds passed, an eternity stretched on a wire of silent dread. He placed the phone face down on the table, the screen dark. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his chair. The movement was fluid, practiced. His hand slid not to his glass, but back inside his tailored jacket, to a place where no one would ever expect a gun to be at a wedding reception. But it was there, a compact matte black pistol. Deadly. Efficient. The gunshot wasn't a deafening boom. It was a sharp, ugly crack that sliced through the music and laughter like a shard of glass. For a moment, some guests thought a champagne cork had popped with unusual force. But then came the first scream. On the dance floor, Gabby froze in Elijah's arms. Her eyes, wide with shock, were fixed on her husband's face. A small, dark blossom of crimson began to spread across the ivory satin of her gown, a grotesque flower blooming over her heart. The fairy tale shattered. The dream became a nightmare of blood and confusion. She didn't fall, not yet. She just hung there, a question in her eyes, as the life began to drain from them. Chaos is a tidal wave. It erupted in the ballroom, a frantic, shrieking surge of panic that sent guests scrambling, overturning chairs and shattering glasses. The beautiful, ordered world of the Sterling wedding collapsed into a primal scene of terror. Yet, in the eye of this hurricane, one man stood perfectly still. Harrison Sterling Sr. remained on his feet by the head table, the black pistol held loosely at his side, a thin curl of smoke rising from its barrel. His face was a void. There was no rage, no remorse, no madness. There was only the profound, chilling calm of a man who had completed a necessary task. Elijah didn't immediately comprehend the sound. His world had narrowed to the woman in his arms. He only knew she had gone rigid, that the light in her eyes was flickering. "Gabby," he whispered, his voice a child's plea. Then he felt the warmth spreading against his hand on her back. He looked down and saw the blood, a vivid, horrifying scarlet against the pure white of her dress and his crisp tuxedo shirt. The reality hit him not as a thought, but as a physical blow that stole the air from his lungs. "No, no, no, no!" Her knees buckled. He tried to hold her up. His arms, which moments ago had held a bride, now struggled to keep a dying woman from collapsing. The screams of the guests finally registered, a cacophony of horror that seemed to come from a great distance. "Somebody help!" a woman shrieked. "Call 911!" Elijah lowered Gabby gently to the polished dance floor, her head lolling back. "Gabby, baby, look at me. Stay with me," he begged, his hands hovering over the wound, useless and trembling. Her eyes were unfocused, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. He looked up then, his gaze sweeping the panicked room until it landed on the one point of stillness. His father. Harrison stood there, a statue of death amidst the chaos, the gun still in his hand. Their eyes met across the screaming abyss. Elijah's were filled with a desperate, uncomprehending agony. Harrison's were empty, cold. He looked at his son, at the woman bleeding out on the floor, and slowly he lowered the weapon and placed it on the white linen tablecloth next to his uneaten slice of wedding cake. Then he sat back down in his chair, folded his hands, and waited. The first Atlanta PD patrol cars arrived in under 6 minutes, their sirens wailing, their blue and red lights painting the panicked faces of the guests in grotesque, flashing strokes. The officers burst in, weapons drawn, expecting an active shooter, a hostage situation, anything but this. They found a king sitting calmly at his throne, the instrument of death laid out before him like a piece of silverware. "He did it! He shot her!" someone yelled, pointing a shaking finger. Harrison didn't flinch as the officers approached. "Put your hands on the table, sir. Slowly," one commanded. He complied without a word, his movements measured. He didn't resist as they pulled him to his feet, cuffed his hands behind his back, and read him his rights. He was utterly, unnervingly passive. As they led him away, he passed the dance floor where paramedics were now frantically working on Gabrielle, their efforts futile. He didn't look at her. He looked only at Elijah, who was kneeling in a growing pool of his wife's blood, his face a mask of catatonic shock. For a moment, something flickered in Harrison's eyes. Not regret, but something akin to pity. Then it was gone. 30 minutes later, the scene was cordoned off, a sterile, procedural bubble imposed over the tragedy. Detective Angelina Angie Falcone stepped under the yellow tape, her sharp eyes taking in the jarring juxtaposition of celebration and death. The floral arrangements, the half-eaten plates of food, the overturned glasses of champagne, and in the center of it all, a body bag. Angie was a homicide detective forged in the furnaces of Atlanta's toughest precincts. An Italian-American woman in a world dominated by men. She had a reputation for being relentless, sharp, and immune to bullshit, especially the kind that came with money and power. And this scene reeked of it. "Talk to me," she said to the uniformed officer in charge. "Victim is Gabrielle Laurent, 28. Just married the groom, Elijah Sterling. Shooter is the groom's father, Harrison Sterling Sr. At least 50 witnesses saw him stand up, shoot her once in the chest, and then sit back down. Weapon is on the table. He was taken into custody without incident, waiting for transport downtown. Angie's gaze drifted to Harrison, who was being held in a separate room, visible through a glass door. He was just sitting there, staring at the wall. Without incident? She repeated, an eyebrow raised. He just shot his new daughter-in-law in front of 100 people and then waited patiently to be arrested? Like he was waiting for a bus, detective. Angie felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't a crime of passion. Passion was messy, loud, chaotic. This was something else entirely. This was an execution. She walked over to the head table, now a crime scene. She noted the expensive bottle of champagne, the fine china, and the murder weapon lying next to a neatly folded napkin. Then she saw it. A high-end smartphone, face down. But it was the way it was positioned, slightly apart from everything else, that caught her eye. It felt deliberate. Why kill his daughter-in-law in cold blood, in the most public way imaginable? The answer wasn't in the gun. Angie had a feeling it was somewhere in the life he had just destroyed, and the secrets that died with it. The interrogation rooms at Atlanta PD headquarters were designed to strip away power. They were small, windowless boxes painted a depressing shade of institutional gray, furnished with nothing more than a bolted-down metal table and a few uncomfortable chairs. The air was thick with the ghosts of desperate lies and forced confessions. But when Harrison Sterling Sr. was led into Interrogation Room 3, he didn't seem diminished. He seemed to own the space, sitting down with the same imposing posture he'd use at the head of a corporate boardroom. He wasn't a suspect. He was a CEO handling a hostile inquiry. Detective Angie Falcone entered a few minutes later, carrying a thin file. She sat opposite him, her expression neutral. She'd seen all kinds of killers in her career, the panicked, the remorseful, the sociopathic. Harrison was a new category. He was serene. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice even, "you have the right to have your lawyer present." "He's on his way," Harrison replied, his voice a low, steady baritone. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "But I don't mind answering some preliminary questions." Angie leaned forward slightly. "Good. Let's start with the most important one. Why? Why did you shoot Gabrielle Laurent?" Harrison's gaze was direct, unwavering. There was no flicker of emotion in his dark eyes. "I did what was necessary." The response hung in the sterile air. Not an excuse, not a denial, a statement of fact. "Necessary for what?" Angie pressed. "She was your son's wife. They were married for less than an hour. My actions were taken to protect my family, to protect my son, to protect the Sterling name." Angie felt a flash of frustration, but she kept her face impassive. This was a game of chess, and he had just made a deliberately obtuse opening move. Protect them from what? From a 28-year-old community organizer? What threat did she pose that required a bullet to the heart? For the first time, a shadow of something crossed Harrison's face. It looked like contempt. "You wouldn't understand. People like you can't possibly comprehend what it takes to build something that lasts. What must be done to defend it from corruption. People like you." The phrase was a carefully chosen barb. It was a dismissal of her authority, her world, her entire being. He was putting a wall between them, a wall of wealth, power, and race. He, the black patriarch who had conquered a white world, and she, the white cop who was a mere functionary in it. She refused to take the bait. "Try me," she said, her voice dropping a notch, becoming steelier. "We have dozens of witnesses, Mr. Sterling. They all said the same thing. You were sitting, you looked at your phone, and then you stood up and shot her. Let's talk about that phone. What was on it? Who sent you the message that made you decide to become a murderer?" Harrison's composure didn't waver, but his hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, tightened into fists for a brief second. "That is a private matter." "It stopped being a private matter the moment you pulled the trigger," Angie shot back. "We'll get a warrant. We'll see what was on that phone." A slow, cold smile touched Harrison's lips. It was a terrifying sight. "I'm afraid you won't." He gestured vaguely toward the evidence bag on a side table, which contained the glittering, shattered remains of his smartphone. "There was an unfortunate accident while I was being escorted from the premises. It slipped." Angie stared at him. He hadn't just killed a woman. He had systematically, coldly, and immediately begun destroying the evidence that would explain why. He had orchestrated not just the murder, but the cover-up of his motive, all in the space of minutes. This level of calculation was beyond anything she had seen. He wanted them to know he did it. He just refused to let them know why. He was controlling the narrative even from inside a locked room, in handcuffs. His lawyer, a slick, high-powered attorney named Marcus Thorne, arrived moments later and shut down the interview. Angie left the room, the knot in her stomach now a block of ice. She stood outside, watching Harrison through the one-way glass as he conferred with his legal counsel. He looked completely at ease, as if discussing a minor business transaction. "What have we got on the victim?" she asked a junior detective who was waiting for her. Gabrielle Laurent, originally from a small town in South Carolina, moved to Atlanta 6 years ago. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket. Ran a nonprofit for at-risk youth in the West End. Everyone we've spoken to so far says she was a saint. Beloved, the classic had no enemies victim. "Everyone has enemies," Angie muttered, her eyes still locked on Harrison. She just had one she didn't know about. The motive was the key. Without it, this was just a senseless act of violence. But Angie knew it wasn't senseless. It was deliberate. It was precise. And the reason for it had been on that phone. Harrison had shattered the clue, but the information it contained still existed somewhere. It was a secret he was willing to kill to protect. And now, a secret he was willing to go to prison to keep. And Angie knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had to find out what it was. The ghost wasn't on the phone anymore. It was in Gabrielle's past. The Sterling mansion wasn't a home. It was a statement. A sprawling neoclassical behemoth of white columns and perfectly symmetrical windows. It sat on 10 acres of impossibly green land in the heart of Buckhead. It was designed to intimidate, to broadcast a message of unassailable success. When Detective Falcone's unmarked sedan crunched up the long, gravel driveway the next day, she felt like she was approaching a fortress rather than a house in mourning. Victoria Sterling met her at the door. In the harsh light of day, without the soft, forgiving glow of the wedding reception, she looked fragile, her carefully constructed elegance beginning to crack. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, but she held herself with a rigid dignity that was clearly the product of decades of practice. She led Angie into a formal living room that looked more like a museum exhibit than a place where people lived. The air was cold, scented with lemon polish and lilies. "Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Sterling," Angie began, taking a seat on a pristine white sofa that felt too valuable to touch. "I know this is an impossibly difficult time." "Difficult doesn't begin to cover it, Detective," Victoria said, her voice a strained whisper. She clutched a silk handkerchief in her hands, twisting it relentlessly. "My son, he won't speak to me. He won't speak to anyone. He's just gone, locked himself away." She looked at Angie, her eyes pleading. "They're saying my husband. They're saying he just did it. For no reason. But Harrison doesn't do anything without a reason. Everything he does is calculated." "That's what I'm here to understand," Angie said gently. "His reason? In his statement, he said he did it to protect the family, to protect the Sterling name. What did he mean by that?" Victoria let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half sigh, half sob. She stared out the large bay window at the perfect empty gardens. "The Sterling legacy," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "That's all he's ever cared about. More than me, more than Elijah even, the legacy." She began to talk, and as she did, Angie got her first real glimpse into the poisonous root of the Sterling family tree. Victoria described a man obsessed not just with success, but with creating a dynasty. Harrison had clawed his way up from poverty in a segregated South. He had faced down racism, sabotage, and condescension at every turn. He hadn't just beaten the system, he had conquered it. But the battle had left deep scars. "He believes the world is always waiting for a black man like him to fail," Victoria explained, her voice gaining a bitter edge. "So, he built this. All of this, a fortress. He believes the Sterlings have to be more than successful. We have to be perfect, unimpeachable. Our bloodline, our reputation, everything has to be a weapon against their prejudice." Angie listened, her pen scratching against her notepad. This wasn't just ambition. It was a pathology born from trauma. And Gabrielle, did she somehow threaten that legacy? Victoria hesitated, her gaze dropping to the twisted handkerchief in her lap. Harrison. Vets every woman Elijah has ever brought home. Seriously, I mean. He hires people, private investigators. He runs background checks, financial inquiries, even family medical histories. He says he needs to know there are no weaknesses that can be exploited, no skeletons. Did he do that with Gabrielle? Angie asked, leaning forward. No, Victoria said, shaking her head. And that was the strange part. When Elijah first brought her home, Harrison was his usual cold, suspicious self. He saw her community work as a liability, her lack of family connections as a red flag. Elijah told him, for the first time in his life, to back off. He said he loved her, and if his father ran an investigation, he would walk away from the company and never look back. This was a crucial piece. Elijah had drawn a line in the sand. And how did Harrison react to that? He was furious. For about a week, the tension in this house was unbearable. Then, one day, he just conceded. He told Elijah he was right, that he was happy for him. He gave them his blessing. He paid for this entire wedding. He even gave Gabby the Sterling family heirloom, a diamond brooch that has been passed down for generations. We were all so relieved. We thought he had finally let go. Her voice broke. We were so wrong. Angie's mind was racing. Harrison hadn't let go. He had simply gone underground. He had likely hired a private investigator off the books, paying in cash, leaving no trail for his son or the police to find. He had pretended to accept Gabrielle while secretly digging for a weakness, for a skeleton. And 3 months later, at the wedding, he had apparently found one. The final report, the kill shot of information, must have been what he received in that text message. Mrs. Sterling, Angie asked carefully, did your husband ever express any specific concerns about Gabrielle? Anything at all that seemed out of place? Victoria thought for a moment, frowning. There was one thing. He was obsessed with the idea of grandchildren. He always was. He would talk about continuing the line, about Elijah having sons to carry the Sterling name into the next generation. He even tried to insist Elijah's previous girlfriends get fertility testing. She shuddered at the memory. Elijah refused, of course. With Gabby, after he gave his blessing, he never mentioned it again. I assumed he had made peace with it. But he hadn't made peace. He had been waiting for the results of his secret war. Angie stood up, her mind clear on the next step. Harrison wasn't looking for a financial scandal or a criminal past. He was looking for something much more fundamental, something that, in his twisted view, would corrupt the Sterling bloodline and destroy the legacy he had killed to build. She had to search Gabrielle's life, not for a crime, but for a secret so profound that a man would choose murder over its revelation. There's a world of difference between the manicured perfection of Buckhead and the vibrant, gritty reality of Atlanta's West End. It was a difference of miles and millions of dollars. Gabrielle Laurent's apartment was on the second floor of a modest red brick walk-up, nestled on a street where the sounds of children playing and distant sirens were a constant backdrop. When Angie Falcone arrived with a devastated Elijah Sterling in tow, the contrast to the cold grandeur of his family's estate was jarring. Elijah looked like a ghost. His eyes were hollow, sunk into a face pale with grief and sleeplessness. He had insisted on coming, a desperate need to connect with some part of Gabby that was still real, still tangible. I've never been inside, he said quietly as Angie prepared to use the key they'd recovered from Gabby's purse. His voice was hoarse, empty. Angie paused, turning to him. You dated for 2 years. You were engaged. You never came to her apartment? Elijah shook his head, a fresh wave of pain washing over his face. She always said it was too small, that she was embarrassed by it. We always stayed at my place or went out. I never pushed. I wanted to respect her space. He looked up at the peeling paint on the doorframe. Now I realized it wasn't about space. It was about secrets. The apartment was small, but it was anything but embarrassing. It was filled with life. Books overflowed from shelves, plants trailed green vines down the walls, and colorful textiles from local markets were draped over the simple furniture. Photos of laughing children from her community center were tacked to a corkboard above a cluttered desk. The whole place radiated a warmth and personality that stood in stark opposition to the sterile, museum-like quality of the Sterling mansion. This was a home. "She lived here," Elijah whispered, running a trembling hand over the spine of a poetry book. This was her world. "We need to look through everything, Elijah," Angie said, her voice gentle but firm. "Anything that might tell us what your father was looking for." The search began. 2 uniformed officers methodically worked their way through the space while Angie directed, and Elijah stood in the middle of the living room, a lost ship in a small foreign sea. They checked her laptop, her financial records, her personal correspondence. They found nothing. Gabrielle Laurent appeared to be exactly who she said she was, a passionate, dedicated woman with a modest income, a lot of friends, and a deep love for her community. There were no hidden debts, no secret lovers, no dark past hinted at in a diary. It was frustratingly, heartbreakingly normal. "There's nothing here," Elijah said after an hour, his voice edged with despair. "She was perfect. My father is just a monster." "Monsters usually have a reason, even if it's one only they understand," Angie replied, not taking her eyes off the room. She was scanning everything, looking for something out of place. Her detective's intuition, the little hum of wrongness she'd learned to trust, was buzzing. Gabby had kept her fiancé, the love of her life, out of this apartment for 2 years. There had to be a reason, a physical object she couldn't risk him seeing. She ran her hand along the wall of bookshelves, her fingers tapping the spines. Then she moved to the worn armchair, checking under the cushions. Nothing. The bedroom was the same, simple, neat, clothes in the closet, a half-finished novel on the nightstand. "Detective, you might want to see this," one of the officers called from the living room. He was on his knees, running his hand over the hardwood floor near the main bookshelf. "The boards feel uneven here." Angie knelt beside him. She pressed down on one of the wooden planks. It gave slightly, with a faint groan. Using a pry tool from her kit, she carefully worked it loose. Beneath it was not subflooring, but a small, dark void. And nestled inside that void was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, secured with a simple padlock. Elijah's breath hitched. He moved closer, his eyes fixed on the box as if it were a venomous snake. "Did you know about this?" Angie asked him. He shook his head, mesmerized. "Never." The lock was cheap. It took Angie less than 30 seconds with a pair of lockpicks to spring it open. The metallic click echoed in the silent, heavy air of the apartment. Every person in the room held their breath. This was it. This was the secret. The skeleton Harrison Sterling had unearthed and used as a death warrant. Angie lifted the lid. Oh, there was no money inside. No jewels. No weapon. It was filled with paper. A thick stack of documents, yellowed with age at the bottom, crisp and white at the top. On the very top of the pile was a faded photograph of a young, awkward-looking teenager with short-cropped hair and sad eyes, wearing an ill-fitting boy's suit. Elijah stared at the photo, a deep frown creasing his brow. "Who is that?" he murmured. "He looks familiar." Angie didn't answer. She carefully lifted the photograph, her gloved fingers revealing the document beneath it. It was an official document from the state of South Carolina, a birth certificate. She read the name printed in stark block letters. It wasn't Gabrielle Laurent. The name on the certificate was Noah Williams, and under the box for sex, the letter printed was a clear, undeniable M. The room tilted. The air grew thin. The secret wasn't just a skeleton in the closet. It was a complete reconstruction of a life, hidden away under the floorboards, and Angie finally understood the nature of the threat Harrison Sterling had perceived. It was a threat to his most precious, poisoned ideal, his bloodline. The silence that fell over Gabrielle's apartment was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The faint sounds of the city outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the rustle of paper in Angie's gloved hands and Elijah's ragged, shallow breathing. He stared at the birth certificate, his mind refusing to process the information his eyes were seeing. "Noah Williams?" he finally whispered, the name a foreign, impossible sound on his tongue. "What is this? Some kind of mistake?" "I don't think so," Angie said softly, her gaze full of a pained empathy. She carefully lifted the birth certificate, revealing the layers of documents beneath. It was a meticulous chronological history of a life remade. There were medical records detailing a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, prescriptions for hormone replacement therapy, legal petitions for a name change, first to Noah Gabrielle Williams, then, finally, to Gabrielle Laurent. There were surgical reports from a clinic in Thailand, filled with clinical, dispassionate language describing the procedures that had physically transformed Noah into Gabrielle. It was an entire history, locked away in a metal box. The story of a boy from a small, conservative South Carolina town who had fought to become the woman she knew herself to be. Elijah staggered back, catching himself on the arm of a chair. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of gray. "No," he breathed. "That's not possible. I would have known." He looked from the documents in Angie's hands to the photograph of the sad-eyed teenager, Noah. He could see it now. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth. It was her. It was the ghost of the woman he loved, a version of her he never knew existed. The realization hit him with the force of a physical assault. The 2 years they had spent together, the intimacy they had shared, the future they had planned, it all replayed in his mind, now tainted by a secret he couldn't comprehend. "Modern medicine, Elijah," Angie said, her voice pulling him back from the brink, and a fierce determination to leave a painful past behind. She built a new life from scratch. She became Gabrielle. "She lied to me," he choked out, the words raw with betrayal. "For 2 years, every day she lied to me." "Or maybe she was just trying to survive," Angie countered gently. "Maybe she was afraid that if you knew, you would see Noah, and not the woman she became, the woman you fell in love with." Elijah sank into the chair, his head in his hands. His grief was now a complex, tangled thing, interwoven with confusion and a profound sense of betrayal. He loved Gabby. He loved the woman who had held his hand, who had laughed at his jokes, who had promised to stand by his side forever. But did he ever really know her? The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This was what his father had found, the ultimate weakness, the corruption of the Sterling bloodline. Harrison Sterling Sr., a man obsessed with his patriarchal dynasty, with sons who would carry on his name, had discovered his only heir was about to marry a woman who had been born a man, a woman who could never give him the biological grandchildren he craved. In his father's warped, tyrannical worldview, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. It was a deception so profound that it warranted death. "He knew," Elijah said, his voice muffled by his hands. "The private investigator he hired, he must have dug this up. That text message at the wedding, it must have been the final confirmation, the proof." "It looks that way," Angie affirmed. The motive was no longer a mystery. It was a stark, ugly thing, born of prejudice, obsession, and a monstrous sense of entitlement. But knowing the motive and proving how Harrison obtained the information were two different things. While Elijah grappled with the ruins of his reality, Angie and her team finished their search. They carefully bagged the contents of the metal box. It was the heart of the case now. As they prepared to leave, Elijah's gaze fell on the corkboard above Gabby's desk. Amidst the photos of smiling children, there was one of him and Gabby on the coast, the wind whipping through her hair. She was looking at him with an expression of such pure, unadulterated love that it stole his breath. Tears finally came, hot and silent, tracking paths through the shock on his face. She had loved him. Whatever secret she kept, that part was real. He had felt it every single day, and a new emotion began to bubble up through the grief and betrayal. Rage. A cold, hard fury directed not at the woman who had kept a secret, but at the man who had turned that secret into a death sentence. He had been so focused on Gabby's lie that he had momentarily forgotten the larger, more monstrous truth. His father hadn't killed a secret. He hadn't killed a past identity. He had killed a person. He had killed his person. He had pointed a gun at the heart of his son's happiness and pulled the trigger without a moment's hesitation. "We have to prove it, Detective," Elijah said, his voice suddenly clear and hard as steel. He stood up, wiping the tears from his face. "We have to prove how he found out. We have to burn him to the ground with it." Angie met his gaze. She saw a man whose world had been destroyed, but from the wreckage, something new and dangerous was emerging. The grieving son was gone. In his place was an avenger. "We will," she promised. "I don't care how much money or power he has. We'll find the trail. He won't get away with this." Knowing why Harrison Sterling committed murder was like knowing the destination on a map but having no roads to get there. The motive was clear, sickeningly so, but the district attorney's office needed more than a motive. They needed a chain of evidence. They needed to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Harrison had actively sought out Gabrielle's past, and that the revelation of it was the direct trigger for the shooting. Without that link, the private investigator, the report, the final text message, the defense could argue for a sudden, inexplicable psychotic break, a crime of passion without the passion. It was a weak defense, but with a lawyer as skilled as Marcus Thorne, and a jury potentially swayed by the Sterling name, it was a risk Angie couldn't afford. The problem was, Harrison Sterling was a ghost. Angie and her team spent the next week diving into his life, and it was like punching a block of granite. His financial records were a fortress, managed by a team of cutthroat lawyers and accountants. There were no suspicious cash withdrawals, no checks made out to unknown entities, no payments to any licensed private investigation firm in the state of Georgia or the surrounding region. They pulled his phone records from before the wedding. They were pristine, showing calls to his office, his wife, and various business associates. He hadn't left a single digital footprint. He used a burner, Angie said, pacing in front of the whiteboard in the squad room. The board was covered with photos of the key players and lines connecting them, but the space around Harrison was maddeningly blank. He must have a prepaid phone and cash, untraceable. He's too smart, too methodical to use his own name for something like this. They interviewed dozens of private investigators, showing Gabrielle's photo, asking if they'd been hired to look into her background. No one came forward. Either Harrison had hired someone from out of state, or he'd hired someone unlicensed, a whisper on the street who knew how to stay invisible. The walls were closing in. The media was in a frenzy, painting the story in broad, sensational strokes. Black royalty tragedy. Millionaire patriarchs snaps at altar. Harrison remained silent in his jail cell, a silent, smug spider at the center of a web they couldn't untangle. His lawyer was already floating narratives to the press, stress, a temporary lapse in judgment, a man who had worked too hard and finally broken. It was all bullshit, and Angie knew it, but it was plausible bullshit. Elijah was a wreck, but a focused one. He had channeled his grief into a cold, methodical rage. He tore through his father's home office, searching for any clue, any piece of paper his father might have overlooked. He found nothing. "It's like he knew," Elijah told Angie over the phone, his voice tight with frustration. "He's been planning his defense his whole life. Never leave a trail." Angie felt the weight of the case settling on her shoulders. She had the body, the weapon, the killer, and 50 witnesses. But she didn't have the soul of the crime. She didn't have the proof of the cold, calculated premeditation that this murder demanded. Without it, Harrison Sterling might just trade a life sentence for a decade in a comfortable, minimum security facility. The thought made her physically ill. She was sitting at her desk late one night, staring at the crime scene photos. The ballroom, the flowers, the blood. Her eyes kept returning to the image of the shattered smartphone on the table. Harrison had destroyed it right away, but he'd received the information somehow. If he used a burner phone to communicate with the PI, where was it? It wasn't on him when he was arrested. It wasn't in his car. She pulled up a satellite map of the Sterling estate. It was vast. 10 acres of manicured lawns, dense woods, gardens, and a guest house. He could have tossed it anywhere between the ballroom and the spot where the patrol car picked him up. It was a needle in a haystack the size of a football field. Searching it would be a monumental task, likely a fruitless one. But the image of Harrison's cold, confident smile in the interrogation room flashed in her mind. He was so sure he had gotten away with hiding his why. He believed he was untouchable. That's when the idea sparked. It was a long shot, a desperate, unconventional Hail Mary, but it was the only play she had left. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for the head of the Atlanta PD K-9 unit. "Sergeant Miller," she said, her voice firm with newfound resolve. "This is Detective Falcone. I have a strange request. I need your best electronics detection dog, and I need him yesterday. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Electronics detection? Angie, what the hell are you looking for? A ghost, she replied. A ghost in a machine. And I think Harrison Sterling tried to bury it. She looked back at the map of the estate, a new sense of hope warring with the exhaustion in her bones. They had been looking for a paper trail, a digital trail. It was time to start looking for the device itself. Kilo was not a friendly dog. He was a Belgian Malinois, a lean, muscular creature the color of burnt caramel with eyes that burned with an unnerving intelligence. He wasn't a pet. He was a finely tuned instrument of law enforcement. His specialty was sniffing out the unique chemical compounds used in the manufacturing of electronic components like memory cards and circuit boards. He could find a SIM card buried under 6 inches of dirt. He was Angie's last, best hope. The search of the Sterling estate began at dawn 2 days later. The air was cool and damp, the morning mist clinging to the perfectly manicured lawns. Angie stood with Sergeant Miller and Kilo near the edge of the sprawling property, the ballroom where the murder took place gleaming white in the distance. The area was cordoned off, a silent, sprawling crime scene. The theory is he ditched a burner phone somewhere between the reception hall and where he was put in the squad car, Angie explained, pointing out the path. It's a wide area, woods, thick shrubbery, a creek. If it's here, Kilo will find it, Miller said with quiet confidence. He gave his partner a command in German, and the dog immediately went to work. It was a slow, painstaking process. Kilo moved in a sweeping grid pattern, his nose to the ground, his entire body a taut line of concentration. Miller walked with him, giving quiet words of encouragement. Angie and a small team of officers followed at a distance, their hopes tethered to the movements of this incredible animal. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and beating down on them. They searched the pristine flower beds, the manicured hedges, the base of the ancient oak trees. Kilo would occasionally signal, his posture changing, but each time it was a false positive, a discarded piece of aluminum, a child's lost toy with a battery. The initial spark of hope began to flicker and dim. The estate was simply too big. Harrison could have palmed the phone and thrown it 100 feet into the dense woods that bordered the property line. Elijah arrived mid-morning, unable to stay away. He stood at the edge of the yellow tape, his face etched with a desperate anxiety. He watched the dog, this last, improbable chance for true justice, with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. By early afternoon, they had covered the most likely areas with no success. The frustration was palpable. Maybe we're wrong, Angie, a junior detective said, wiping sweat from his brow. Maybe he destroyed it some other way. No, Angie said, her gaze fixed on Kilo. He's arrogant. He thought he could just toss it and it would disappear forever. He wouldn't have taken the risk of carrying it off the property. Miller decided to change tactics. Let's try the perimeter, the tree line. If he wanted it gone, he'd throw it deep. They moved to the edge of the manicured lawn, where it met a thick, unkempt border of azalea bushes and dense undergrowth. It was the kind of place where things got lost and were never found again. Kilo plunged into the brush, momentarily disappearing from sight. They could hear him snuffling and pushing through the leaves. And then, a sharp, commanding bark. It was different from his other sounds. It was a bark of discovery. Miller scrambled into the bushes after him. "He's got something!" he yelled. Angie and her team pushed through the branches, which snagged at their clothes. They found Kilo pawing insistently at the base of a massive azalea bush, his tail rigid. He was focused on a patch of disturbed earth and thick leaves. Miller gently pulled the dog back. "Show me, boy, show me." Angie knelt down, her heart pounding. She carefully brushed away the leaves and loose dirt. And then she saw it. It was a cheap black prepaid phone, a burner. It was scuffed and dirty from the impact of a hard throw, but it was intact. The screen was dark, the battery likely dead. But it was there. The needle in the haystack, the ghost in the machine. A wave of triumphant relief washed over her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She looked up and met Elijah's eyes through the bushes. He was staring at the phone, his face a mixture of awe and fierce, vindicated hatred. "We got him," Angie breathed, carefully lifting the phone with a gloved hand and placing it into an evidence bag. "We got you, you son of a bitch." Back at the precinct, the forensics lab worked its magic. They charged the phone, bypassed the simple lock, and downloaded its contents. It was exactly what Angie had prayed for. A sparse call log with only one recurring number, a series of encrypted text messages, and the final damning piece of evidence received at 6 to 12 p.m. on the day of the wedding, the exact moment Gabrielle and Elijah were sharing their first dance. It was a message from the burner's only contact. It contained a single file attachment. When the tech expert opened the file, Gabrielle Laurent's entire hidden history filled the screen. A concise, brutally efficient report from an unlicensed investigator, complete with scanned copies of a birth certificate for Noah Williams, medical records, and legal name change documents. The last message from Harrison to the investigator, sent just moments before he received the report, was simple and chilling. Final confirmation? Now. They had it all. The premeditation, the cold, calculated hunt, the trigger. They had the soul of the crime. Harrison Sterling's wall of silence was about to be blown to smithereens. When Angie Falcone walked back into interrogation room 3, the air was different. The first time, she had been probing for weakness, looking for a crack in the fortress of Harrison Sterling's arrogance. This time, she was holding a sledgehammer. Harrison sat with the same immovable posture, his expensive lawyer beside him. He looked up as Angie entered, a flicker of mild curiosity in his eyes. He clearly believed his secrets were safe. Angie didn't say a word. She walked to the table and placed a single evidence bag in the center. Inside was the scuffed black burner phone. Harrison's eyes locked onto it, and for the first time since his arrest, his mask of serene control slipped. It was a micro-expression, a brief widening of the eyes, a tightening at the corners of his mouth. But it was there. It was the look of a king realizing his castle has been breached. "We found it," Angie said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "In an azalea bush on the edge of your property. It seems you didn't throw it quite far enough." The lawyer, Marcus Thorne, immediately spoke up. "My client has no knowledge of that device. You can't prove it's his." Angie smiled, a cold, sharp expression. "Oh, I think we can." She placed a stack of papers next to the phone. "This is the call and text log from the device. A series of encrypted messages to an unlicensed PI named Frank Miller, a real piece of work who, for a reduced sentence on an unrelated charge, has already confirmed he was hired by you, in cash 3 months ago to dig up every piece of dirt he could find on Gabrielle Laurent." Harrison remained silent, but his jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along his cheek. Angie wasn't finished. She slid the top sheet of paper across the table. It was a printout of the final file Harrison had received. At the top was the birth certificate for Noah Williams. "And this," she said, her voice dropping, "is the report Mr. Miller sent you at 6:12 p.m. on Saturday. The final confirmation you requested. The information you received just moments before you stood up, pulled out a gun you illegally brought to your son's wedding, and executed his wife on the dance floor." She leaned forward, her eyes boring into his. "So, let's stop playing games, Mr. Sterling. The narrative about a psychotic break is dead. We have you. We have the motive, we have the planning, we have the premeditation. The only question left is whether you want to tell your side of the story or let these documents tell it for you." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Thorne was whispering furiously to his client, but Harrison wasn't listening. He was staring at the birth certificate, at the name Noah Williams. A low sound, like a growl, began to build in his chest. His composure finally, spectacularly, shattered. "You still don't get it, do you?" He spat, his voice no longer a controlled baritone, but a raw, venomous rasp. He surged forward, his cuffed hands slamming down on the metal table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the small room. "You think this is about a secret? This is about an infestation, a lie, a parasite that was about to attach itself to my family." Thorne tried to restrain him. "Harrison, stop." But the dam had broken. Decades of repressed fury, of obsession, of tyrannical control came pouring out. "I built my name from the dirt," he roared, his eyes blazing with a righteous, terrifying fire. "I fought off wolves in suits who wanted to see me fail, who called me every name in the book. I built an empire to protect my family. to give my son a name that meant something, a name that was armor, and he brings that into my house? A deception? A man pretending to be a woman, thinking he could become a Sterling, carry on my line? It was an abomination. It was a confession, but it was devoid of remorse. It was a justification, a manifesto of hate, prejudice, and wounded pride. He wasn't confessing to a crime. He was boasting about a cleansing. She wasn't a woman, he screamed, his face contorted. She couldn't give him a son. She couldn't give him a real child. She was a dead end, a genetic dead end that would have ended everything I have ever worked for, my legacy, my blood. Angie listened, her stomach turning. She let him vent, let the recording devices capture every single poisoned word. This was the real Harrison Sterling, stripped bare of his tailored suits and his veneer of respectability. This was the tyrant of the gilded cage, a man so terrified of the world's judgment that he had become a monster to his own family. I didn't kill a person, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, chilling whisper, his chest heaving. I cut out a cancer. I did what had to be done. I did it for Elijah. One day he'll understand. I saved him. I saved the Sterling name. Angie sat back, a profound sadness washing over her disgust. He truly believed it. In his twisted reality, he was the hero of this story. I think that's enough for today, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She stood up and nodded to the officer at the door. As they led Harrison away, he was still muttering about bloodlines and legacies, a fallen king raving in his conquered castle. Angie walked out of the observation room, where the entire confession had been watched by the DA and her team. She felt exhausted, drained. She had gotten what she needed. She had uncovered the soul of the crime, but it was a soul so ugly, so rotten, that it felt like a victory for no one. Her phone buzzed. It was Elijah. Is it true? He asked, his voice strained. They found the phone? Yes, Angie said. And he confessed. We have everything. There was a long pause. I need to see him, Elijah said, his voice dangerously quiet. I need to look him in the eye and hear it from his mouth. I need to face the man who destroyed my life. The room where father and son finally met was the same sterile gray box where Harrison had confessed, but now it felt like a sacred space, an arena for a final, tragic battle. A thick pane of reinforced glass separated the two men, a physical manifestation of the unbridgeable chasm that now lay between them. Elijah sat on one side, his face pale but his eyes burning with a cold, clear light. Harrison sat on the other, stripped of his fine suit and dressed in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that seemed to swallow his powerful frame, making him look smaller, older. When Harrison saw his son, a flicker of something desperate and hopeful crossed his face. He leaned forward, placing his hand on the glass. Elijah, he said, his voice raspy, pleading. Thank God. You came. You have to understand. I don't have to do anything. Elijah cut him off, his voice flat and devoid of the warmth it once held. Except listen. Detective Falcone played me the recording, but I wanted to see your face when you said it. Tell me. Tell me why you killed my wife. The word wife made Harrison flinch. That thing was not your wife, he said, the venom returning to his voice. It was a liar. It deceived you. It would have destroyed our name. Our name? Elijah let out a short, bitter laugh. You mean your name, your legacy, your bloodline. Let me ask you something, Father. In all your planning, in all your investigation into her past, did you ever once investigate the person she was? Did you know that she volunteered at a soup kitchen every Thanksgiving? Did you know she spent her weekends teaching inner-city kids how to read? Did you know she had a laugh that could make you forget every bad thing in the world? That is irrelevant sentimentality, Harrison shot back, his frustration mounting. I was protecting the future, our future, 20 generations of men and women who fought to survive, to build something. It was all going to end with you, tricked into a barren, fraudulent union. We were going to adopt, Elijah said quietly, the words dropping into the tense silence like stones into a still pond. We talked about it. Gabby loved children. She couldn't have them biologically, but she would have been an incredible mother. We would have given a child a home, a life. We would have given them the Sterling name. Harrison stared at him, his face a mask of genuine, uncomprehending horror. Adopt? You would bring a stranger's blood into my house? Raise another man's child and call it a Sterling? That's not a legacy, that's a surrender. It's an insult to everything I've built. And in that moment, Elijah finally saw his father for who he truly was. Not a strong protector, but a man terrified and small, trapped in a prison of his own, making long before the state had put him in one. A man so obsessed with the purity of blood that he couldn't see the purity of a loving heart. "You're sick," Elijah said, his voice laced with a sorrowful finality. "All my life, I looked up to you. I tried to be the son you wanted. I followed your rules. I went to your schools. I joined your company. I tried to live up to this grand legacy. And for what? So you could feel powerful? So you could build a fortress against ghosts that live only in your head?" He leaned forward, his own hand rising to meet his father's on the glass, a mirror image of broken connection. "The legacy you were so desperate to protect doesn't exist anymore. You killed it. You killed it on that dance floor, along with the only woman I have ever loved. Your bloodline, your precious, pure bloodline, ends with me. I will never have a biological child. I will make sure of it. The Sterling name as you know it dies with you, rotting in this cell." Harrison recoiled as if struck. The threat was more devastating than any physical blow. "No," he whispered, his face ashen. "You can't. You are a Sterling. It's in your veins." "What's in my veins is a choice," Elijah said, standing up. His shoulders were back, and for the first time, he looked taller than the man on the other side of the glass. He was no longer the son seeking approval. He was the judge delivering a verdict. "I choose love. I choose acceptance. I choose everything you despise. Gabrielle taught me that. Her legacy will be one of compassion. Yours will be a cautionary tale told in whispers about a hateful old man who destroyed his own family." He turned to leave. "Elijah, wait!" Harrison called out, his voice cracking with desperation, the tyrant's roar reduced to a pathetic plea. "Don't do this. The family—" Elijah paused at the door, but didn't look back. "You are not my family anymore," he said, his voice clear and steady. "You're just the man who murdered my wife." He walked out of the room, leaving Harrison Sterling Sr. alone with the ruins of his empire, a king of a barren kingdom, finally and utterly defeated, not by the outside world he so feared, but by the poison he had nurtured within himself. The trial of Harrison Sterling Sr. was a media circus, a spectacle of wealth, tragedy, and prejudice laid bare for the nation to see. But for Elijah, it was just noise. He sat in the front row every day, a silent, stoic presence. He listened as the prosecution, led by Detective Falcone's airtight case, laid out the cold, premeditated facts. He listened as his father's expensive lawyer tried to paint a picture of a man driven to madness, a narrative that crumbled under the weight of Harrison's own hate-filled, recorded confession. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, murder in the first degree, and the judge handed down a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, Elijah felt nothing. There was no triumph, no relief, no closure. Justice couldn't bring Gabby back. It couldn't undo the damage. It was just an ending to a horrific chapter. As his father was led away in chains, Harrison looked at his son one last time, his eyes searching for something. Forgiveness, understanding, a flicker of the son he once knew. He found nothing but a stranger's cold gaze. In the aftermath, the world expected Elijah Sterling to crumble or to flee. Instead, he began to build. His mother, Victoria, in a surprising act of defiance and rebirth, divorced Harrison and, with Elijah's support, took an active role on the board of Sterling Enterprises. The gilded cage had opened, and she was learning to fly. Together, she and Elijah began to fundamentally reshape the company. The fortress Harrison had built to keep the world out was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into a bridge. They launched the Gabby Laurent Foundation, a multi-million-dollar initiative dedicated to supporting LGBTQ+ youth centers and community organizers in underserved neighborhoods. They shifted the focus of Sterling Enterprises from luxury high-rises to developing affordable, high-quality housing. Elijah was transforming his father's legacy of exclusion into a new legacy of inclusion. He was using the power his father had worshipped to heal the very wounds his father had inflicted. 2 years after the trial, Angie Falcone received a small, cream-colored envelope at her desk. Inside was not a letter, but a photograph. It showed Elijah, his face relaxed and smiling, a genuine smile she hadn't seen since before the wedding. He was holding the hand of a little girl, about 5 years old, with bright, curious eyes and a joyful grin. They were standing in front of a newly dedicated library wing. On the back of the photo, a short handwritten note read, "Angie, meet Gabrielle Sterling. We finalized the adoption last week. A new chapter. Thank you for everything." "Elijah," Angie smiled, a real heartfelt smile. She pinned the photograph to the bulletin board above her desk, a small beacon of hope amidst the grim realities of her job. Far away, in a maximum security prison, Harrison Sterling Sr. sat in his cell. He spent his days in silence, the ghost of his ambitions his only companion. He had won the battle against the world, but he had lost the war for his son's soul. He had protected his bloodline so fiercely that he had ended it. In Atlanta, life went on. A new Sterling legacy was being written, not in blood, but in action. Elijah would often take his daughter, Gabby, to the park or to the library, the same places her namesake had found so much joy. He was raising her with stories not of power and dynasties, but of kindness, courage, and the beautiful radical act of acceptance. The lesson from the ashes of the Sterling tragedy was a simple yet profound one. A true legacy is not an inheritance of wealth or a purity of blood. It is not a fortress built to keep others out. A true legacy is the love you cultivate and the bridges you build. It is the open hand, not the clenched fist. It is the grace you give to the world, a gift that, unlike stone and steel, can never be destroyed.